determined comprised of the framework, link, alt, impact. Not network.
Okay. Got that. So that answers my second question. What is the structure of a critique? Yeah, usually a framework, link, impact, and an alternative. Makes sense. Everybody's down. Knows what that is, right? So, what are the types of criticisms that people usually write?
10, not 10:30. The schedule is weird in case you're confused.
So after 10, we just go to lab?
Yeah, and lab will get out at 11:30 like normal.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's fine. Still not good. Yes.
Verify, please.
Yeah, okay, so yes, yeah, verify. So that's one critique, right? But I guess a more general question, like, what are different kinds of criticisms just in general, right? Like, not specific, like FemK, CapK, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But, like, what does a criticism usually criticize? I guess is a
like
better way.
resolution or an argument in the app.
Yeah, so argument of the app. Wow, we have a lot of hands. All right. Yes.
Can you criticize like something the app did like performatively?
Sure. Kind of almost falls into argument, but we'll say like the performance of the app, because it can be like rhetoric. Anything else?
I was going to say rhetoric.
Like discourse.
Yeah, so discourse. Like, seems like all these could fall into the same category, but we'll just put them there. It's fine.
So much fluidity.
Yes.
A resolution critique?
Oh yeah, those get kind of tricky because there's only so much I guess the app can do about that. So in my mind, there's a question of whether or not the link story is legitimate, but different strokes for bloods, I guess. Yes.
Critiques of different structures of society that the happening.
Sure. Bring, criticize society that the app defends, right?
The like representations of the app, so how they represent people or like groups of people.
Reps, okay. Any others? Do we think this is a pretty good list? Anything y'all think should be added to that list?
That probably includes everything. Yeah.
Alright, so we know what types of critiques there are. Okay. So we know what types of critiques there are. And we know how a framework of a critique looks like, right? So how do you think you answer a critique?
It's the most important thing is to protect the link.
Why?
Well, because if you delink yourself in the code, it doesn't matter about like the impacts aren't relevant to you, like you're not the problem.
Okay.
So definitely you could do that.
Okay.
Perm the alternative.
Whoa, what does that mean? What's a permutation?
So it is.
I don't know.
A permutation is an argument that says we can do both the app and some part or all of the critique alternative.
Is the permutation always we do the app and the name?
I mean, it could be in different wording or like in different times or in different versions, but it always has to include all of the app and at least some of the neg.
Unless it's perm do the app.
Unless it's perm,
Or perm do the neg.
yeah.
Unless there's severance.
Severance.
Yeah.
Unless it's a severance permutation, yeah. But yeah, that's a pretty good answer. Yes, sir.
The most important thing is the answer to the alt, since that's usually the weakest. You could also delink, or if it's, or like probably not usually because it's impact sure or justify policy making roll the ballot.
Oh goodness, there's a lot that went on in there. Sorry.
I would say, okay, so alt,
Oh,
roll the ballot,
roll the ballot.
and, well, it was delink. We already have it.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Oh, I guess I need to put this because this has been a running joke in our lab.
Oh, no. What is that?
It's from The Legend of Zelda. Link.
The Triforce.
Okay.
Oh!
Impact term?
Okay, well, but sometimes is a legitimate strategy. It depends on what the critique is.
Yes. It really depends. Or else you can go back up here.
Yeah, wow. don't know if you should impact turn like a femme critique or a race critique. I don't think you're going to win that debate. Although there are some people in NCA, I don't know, they might vote for that. Are there any others that we can think of? Yes.
I mean, you can make theoretical objectifications, but that's kind of like not preferable.
Yeah, you can use theory.
Theory. Do you mean like running theory, or do you mean like methodology arguments, like that kind of theory, or just
I would say both. That's something that should be on there. Methodology.
methodology
Yeah.
arguments? We're gonna give one to you.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Read a new K, and then use it to weigh against theirs.
Well, slash.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a new position you could read. I guess just general attacking the critique is what we're focusing on. Oh my gosh. Do I think this is good. Is there anything else that needs to be? Oh, well, link turns usually.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of these can move really quickly.
Yeah, defense and offense. All right. Cool. Last time.
Who Victoria is?
I knew that was going to happen. She's in advanced class X again.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I'm gonna go check their explanation.
We always need those children. Like, this is the thing. Right, Carter? Okay, go ahead.
My children are good. They don't get lost. They just don't show up sometimes. Well, all right. What do you?
We can go through each of these like
Okay.
individually.
Do you want to go through the link? I don't want to stand up and talk the whole time.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So the first thing you can do is attack the link. So this can take a bunch of different forms. If you're looking at it consensively, the way in which you take out the link is, well, no link. The app does not perpetuate the criticism, or the affirmative is not something that links into the criticism you're talking about. That way, no matter what they extend, even if they end up going all in on the alternative or impact or even their framework, so long as you're not linking to the criticism, it's a lot easier for you to like simply say, oh, that means that I'm not violating their framework, or maybe I solved that for anything better. A way in which you can do it to make it offensive is if they say the link is the affirmative, but then you can just link turn it and say, no, actually the negative is linking into the criticism far more. This can also go into like method debates, but simply for the sake of like creating some structure, just think of it as, no, you said I do something bad, but really you're the one who does something bad. Great. You want to go to the permutation?
Sure. So permutation is in pretty self-explanatory, right? I think he gave a pretty good explanation. If you have to do 100% of the app and at least some part of the negative. The reason why this is strategic, right, is because the justifications for the alternative have some reason as to why the alternative solves the impact. Also, these arguments are especially persuasive if made in conjunction with no link arguments, right? So if you can give reasons why you do not link to VK, but then also give reasons as to why perhaps doing the app and then doing the permutation is actually better than doing the permutation alone, that is a way to turn permutation into something that is offensive. So just saying like perm do like all or like both isn't offense because it doesn't give you like a comparative advantage. You need to also be generating reasons as to why doing the app plus doing the permutation is preferable to just doing the criticism alone.
Also on the same wavelength of permutations, something you might run into with K-teams is indicts of the performance of permutations. So that's something you really need to be able to defend yourself against. So for example, you read a policy option, someone gets up and says, oh, the assumptions of the policy option you're having is explicitly racist. Then you could say permutation, use the state, but have the mindset shift that the negative is talking about. What they can end up getting up and saying is that the permutation, even if it does make logical sense, is a bad thing to do because it adheres to things like fluidity, where like you see you're losing an argument, so then you decide to co-opt the arguments of the negative. So the only way in which you really want, if you really want to go for a permutation against K-theme, what you need to do is make sure, one, as Tiniola said, the link is like pretty much gone, and two, you're able to have front lines in response to no access to the permutation, so that way you can appeal to the judge. Because sure, in other debates, for example, plan versus counterplan, permutations can be extremely compelling, but if they're indicting the performance of the permutation, you can't simply just get away with extending it in the next speech. You actually have to defend the act of permuting both sides. Yeah.
Is an alternative to no link, like firm shield link type argument?
Yeah, that's a way in which you could do it, but then I would say make sure you deal with the performative indices, because then that links into the whole like idea of being shifty and saying, oh, I'm not binding into you because now I've permuted it and I'm not doing any bad things anymore. Yeah.
If the K team kicks the alt in the NR and then goes to the link is like just a bunch of just adds to the app, is that like weird?
Yeah.
It's a non-unique distance at
Yeah.
that point.
Yeah.
Like they went off that though? I lost the ground when they went up the links like the
It depends on what the debate was.
I think, yeah, it really does depend. So, for example, I think if the link is more like, so I think it depends on the app too. So if the affirmative is like, we're advocating for inclusion, right? And then the negative has like, the link chain is just like you exclude people of color or you exclude women, and they decide not to go for the alternative. I think in that instance, if they do decide to go for the link, it just functions as turns against their affirmative. So in that instance, that's fine. But oftentimes you can even call them out as in, if they don't even have an alternative, chances are that's probably defending the status quo. The absolute better. So it really depends on the debate. It would take a lot of weighing and stuff.
Yeah, that's a good argument that you definitely need to make for people that kick the alternative, because sometimes a lot of debaters do it. You should just make it very clear in the rebuttal speech that kicking the alternative is akin to maintaining the status quo at that point, right?
And
Wait,
also,
that's fine. Go ahead.
yeah, it's like akin to maintaining the status quo, and also probably would be a performative contradiction, as in, oh, you're talking about certain people being oppressed, right? Did you literally just use their bodies as being fungible for the ballot? You kicked it after you believed you were losing on it. You obviously didn't care, and that really diminishes the credibility. And also, like you could still go for their framework of like inclusion or accessibility or like minimizing oppression, and talk about why kicking the alternative uniquely perpetuates the same harms they're talking about. Yeah.
So that's probably like one of my favorite arguments to make. Like if they don't have like an all, or like they just like criticize the app, then I would make the argument that like it's better, like the app's better than doing nothing. Is there any like authors or anybody who talks about that? Because I've never found one.
About what?
Like
yeah,
it's better to try or die kind of thing.
Well, it depends.
Not like literally die.
Yeah,
But I
I
think
mean,
it depends on what. Yeah, it depends on the lit. Depends on the author. So, for example, I know for like, because like I read a lot of critical race theory. Sometimes they would say, oh, you still need to know how to use policy options. So like an author who says that, two authors who would say that is Milton and Harney. So that's the evidence I would read in that context. But like it really depends as you go across the literature who says what.
So you said Melton and Harney?
No, Milton and Harney. Moten. And Harney. Harney.
So they would say that like it's better to try than to
It's not necessarily try or die, although like it doesn't literally use those words, right? But it talks about how like in order to understand the way in which these systems work, in order to disrupt the system, we need to know how the system works from the inside, and people of color need to know metrics and ways in which they can do that in order to like break it down. But yeah, that's what I use in that context. But it depends on what you're reading.
kicking the alternative and then maintaining the status quo is an advocacy issue. It sounds like it is.
It is.
We were running theory again.
Theory in the 2 a.m.
I don't know.
It gets sticky in LD debates because there's like a speech structure.
So we're on the alt. Okay. Yeah, I just put the permutation of the alt. Really, the things you need to focus more on the alt are just questioning the solvency, the efficacy of the alt, right? So if the alt doesn't solve, probably it's not a good alternative, right? There are a couple things though with regards to focusing on the alt solvency. So you can say the alt doesn't solve, right? Which means that even if there is a disadvantage to the app, i.e., even if you like link and there's an impact, if the alt doesn't solve and there's no way and it actually doesn't and it's not a turn, then it's probably a non-unique argument, I think. There's really no reason why you should vote for the negative in that case. Yeah.
Let's say that the NR goes for like the entire critique for like most of the 6 minutes, and 2AR is definitively winning an answer to the alternative, but they'll concede the link story. Does that mean like 2AR could probably just like, assuming it's like a post BFK, does that mean the affirmative still needs to go for the link story in that speech, or they can just?
I think it depends. Like if you know you're ahead on the weighing debate, and you can probably just make a case for why the alternative doesn't solve, it means that there's no like net beneficial reason why the judge should prefer the alternative, and it just becomes a weighing debate as to whether or not the status quo is marginally better than doing something in the world of the app. I think if you're ahead of the weighing debate, you're probably going to win that debate. And I think you'd probably be ahead of that debate anyway, because if they were going to try to go hard for the alternative, they probably aren't winning reasons why the status quo is uniquely good. They're probably just winning why we should do something different than the status quo. Probably means that you're a little bit ahead because you can at least, at the very least, say, at least I'm doing something, right, to change a problem. But that also gets us into another way which you can engage in the alternative, which is kind of a little bit in leaning into the methods debate, which is arguing that the AF is key to accessing the alternative, right? This is like really good if you're running like critical apps, right? So like if you're reading a CAP app and somebody reads, I don't know, like an ableism critique.
Well, I have a good example. I saw this round yesterday, but it didn't go the way I wanted it to. But anyway, so the affirmative went for DDEV, and they're just like, we have to like destroy these systems and like break down everything, right? Then the negative was talking about Anthro and how we have to create new ethical norms. So I thought the permutation was like, first do the affirmative so we can break down these systems as a gateway to gain access to creating new forms of ethics, which include the non-human animal. So that's a way in which you can say the affirmative is key to the negative. That didn't happen, but that's the way in which you can do it.
Yeah, that's a really good example,
Yeah.
right?
I got another like card question or like an article question. So is there anybody like any argument like when it comes to like oppression where they would say like intent is more important, meaning like justifying like trying better than doing nothing. Like so like even if I try and like I fail, like it's still better than the status quo.
Still sounds like the same question
Yeah,
that you had asked previously. But
yeah.
yeah, there are authors that do.
Yeah.
Right. I know especially in the CAP debate there are authors that like it's better for us to at least try than do nothing.
It really depends on what you're going for.
It depends on what you're going for, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, does everybody understand that? That's a really good example that somebody brought up. That's essentially how it works. But I think you had mentioned earlier that all these things kind of are all,
Yeah, they all
kind of, right? Like, because
So
that's
like
on the
that would be a
permutation flow.
methodology too.
Yeah, then it links to the permutation side of the debate, which, yeah.
You use all of these parts to like respond.
Yeah.
Except for maybe
Yeah.
because that's just like a different formulation.
Yeah, so using like arguments such as your methodology is key to accessing the alternative helps to fuel the legitimacy of the permutation.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, so that way you can also get out of arguments about like stealing performance because it's like, no, I'm not stealing the performance, but rather what you're advocating for can happen when you vote affirmative. There's no reason why those two things cannot exist together.
There's no reason why the performance can't exist in the world of the app. And you probably should make the argument that like it's better in the world of the net better in the world of the app because the app does something that I don't know creates a better space for the performance or.
Yeah. Oh, true. Like better platform. So in the instance of like DDEV, right, by breaking everything down, so we have nothing remaining of before, like whatever harmful ethics we had before, it's a lot easier to form new ethics that include the non-human animal.
Does anybody have any questions? So you will be masters of answering the alternative after this lecture. Excellent.
Yeah.
Oh, welcome.
I'm not going to be masking this.
No, it's fine.
What do you think the proper number of answers you should make to an alternative are? And if so, what ratio of permutations to solvency deficits?
I would say 2 permutations and 2 solvency deficits are pretty good. I mean, if you're winning that there is a...
With today's depth of the
Yeah, you should, that's certainly true, right? You should, especially if it's like, you're reading a story is telling the judge why your story is better than their story. How you kind of have to do K debates.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, roll the ballot argument. So, first, a common misconception is that if someone reads a roll of the ballot, you kind of either have to say, no, roll of the ballot arguments are bad, or like you're forced to link under their roll of the ballot. There's several ways in which you can like deal with this through the roll of the ballot. First, you can create your own, as in they say the roll of the ballot is whoever best minimizes patriarchy, and then your roll of the ballot can be for the, this is what I usually hear, whoever has the best policy option, or whoever has the best real world strategy, or something like that. So that's a way in which you can, sure, their roll of the ballot is nice and all, but we need a better metric in which we can evaluate these arguments. So for example, if you do go for a policy making roll of the ballot, then you can easily say, we need to solve back for oppression, but the best way in which we do this is through some type of real world policy, so that way it's a lot easier for individuals who are oppressed to gain access to some type of tangible alleviation to their harm. A second way in which you can do it is turn their arguments under their own roll of the ballot. So if they say we're minimizing patriarchy, if they use very patriarchal language, for example, you can use like maybe a word pick where they use women instead of women. Do y'all know what I mean by that? Okay, yeah, instead of the E-U-Y. That's a way in which you can show under their roll of the ballot they're perpetuating even more patriarchy. Another way in which you can do that is by talking about how, for example, if they talk about disrupting heteronormativity and they only include, let's say, white queer bodies, a way in which you can say they aren't actually disrupting heteronormativity is because they're still adhering to Eurocentric notions of what that is by not including black queer bodies, and that's a reason why they will never be able to link into their roll of the ballot. So basically making a bunch of terms under their roll of the ballot is a way in which you can use it to your advantage. What else about the roll of the ballot can you do?
I'd say performance contradictions. Seems like that falls under.
Yeah, that falls under there. Yeah. So like specifically with performative contradictions, if they're talking about queer bodies and then they call you him or her without asking you personal pronouns. Like, yeah, that's a way in which you can get the performance under the roll of the ballot. Yeah, I think that's it, right? Do you have anything to add to the roll of the ballot? Yeah, I think we're good. Okay.
Questions? These are becoming more predominant arguments in debate. If you debate on the national circuit, they are pretty.
Do you think that when you read a roll of judge and roll of the ballot, you should also read standard text underneath it?
Oh, okay. I think it depends on the debater, right? So
Yeah.
I always do roll of the judge and roll of the ballot. I don't put a standard underneath because like they both kind of make up the standard, or at least the roll of the ballot for me would be like the standard. So roll of the judge is literally like, judge, you should be an educator. Roll of the ballot is like the ballot is to endorse the best liberation strategy. So the standard would be endorsing liberation strategies, right? So I wouldn't repeat that. It usually is the same thing.
Yeah, just keep in mind that standards are weighing metrics, right?
Yeah.
They just are ways to see how often it's being generated. A roll of the ballot is just another way.
In which you see how often this is generated.
I haven't really heard much people read rolls about read rolls with judges, like besides myself. Like within my team, like when when I debate people, like I haven't heard it yet. I don't know why, but
It's personal preference, I think. I think you know, really the only reason to read it is to establish like the judge as an educator, judge as an X, Y, or Z, right? Sometimes there's just an implicit understanding, depending on who's debating who. But the judge is an educator, saves time to just read all the ballot argument. You can do both, though.
so would you like? I mean, I don't really know anyone who thinks the rolls ballot wouldn't match like critical education, like recipes for with the judge, but like if hypothetically that was a situation, could you make arguments why the roll ballot doesn't link into like critical education if that's like the
Well, if you're arguing that the judge's position is not X, or like, so like let's say they say the role of the judge is an educator, right? Or like a critical educator, right?
Yeah.
And they give their justifications, like critical educators need to, I don't know, resist patriarchy.
That was exactly the example I was thinking of.
Thus, the role of the ballot, the way that we determine offense, right? This is like the most important offensive metric, or a metric to determine how offense is generated is to, like, I don't know, like unflinchingly resist patriarchal manifestations. Something like that. like to me, it would be pretty sufficient to just go after this portion. Like if you go after this portion, there is no reason why a judge is an educator. It begs the question as to whether or not necessarily that whether critical educators should do X, but why the judge should be that critical educator that does X. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I also think, well, also on that, I think if you also make the argument that, for example, if they say unflinchingly resist patriarchy, you can say, like, you're depriving the judge of being a critical educator, because then we're only focusing on one mode of criticism, rather than taking into account different forms of oppression that either intersect adequately with that, or maybe don't even have access to those notions of patriarchy, or don't necessarily have any type of solvency under the idea of patriarchy. So that's a way in which their role of the ballot violates their role of the judge, because it is too static in thought. That's why when you do a role of the ballot, you should try to be more broad, as in like liberation strategies versus like a specific type of group, because then they can call you out for excluding some other type of group. Yeah.
Oh, okay, so that's interesting. That kind of leads me to my next question. So, like, for, like, some of the cases, like, we have, like, the role of the ballot will be, like, endorsed, like, the better liberation strategy, liberation strategy for the oppressed. But then, like, sometimes, like, I might spec, like, if I want to be a more narrow debate, like, I give reasons, for example, why, like, we should discuss, like, issues of, like, sexism in the surrounding, like, issues of, like black oppression, right? So, like, in that instance, like, could that be a problem, like, later in the round?
No. I think role of the ballot, okay, so like framework arguments are supposed to be accessible to both sides, but the substance you have is for you, right? So if the role of the ballot, is best liberation strategy, just because you talk only about women or only about black people doesn't mean that the other side doesn't gain access to the role of the ballot. That's what you're debating about.
Oh, the role of the
They can call
ballot
you out
can't
on
be
it, for
worded
sure,
like a better liberation strategy, like, for women, or like for blacks, right? Like, that shouldn't be the role of the ballot text, you're saying?
Probably not. You can, but like you would get, I think you're pretty susceptible to the index that I was just talking about.
I think it's a little distinct, though.
Like saying resisting, like unflinching resistance of patriarchal structures, because I think there's enough of the literature base that indicates that like all other forms of oppression stem from this argument, from these kind of methodologies. So then it's a sequencing argument, right?
Yeah. If it's a root cause debate, then you can do that.
But like saying resisting patriarchal structures is certainly different than say like the role of the ballot is to like help marginalized women in debate, like, right? Like that's super specific, right? It's not a very general concept. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Then it does become like a root cause debate and a methods debate almost. Yeah.
Do you recommend putting the arguments about a certain group into contention, or like the orange or whatever is weighing? Well, because like our team has just had it like the rule about text, and like right after it, I looked to oppression of whatever group for like 3 reasons.
Oh, that's fine. I
Yeah,
think that's fine.
sure.
Yeah.
An argument I hear a lot when reading like role of ballot type arguments is that they're not like specific enough with like weighing mechanisms and how to weigh offense under them. So like the best liberation strategy press is kind of like vague terms when like trying to compare offense. What is like the best response to that?
I feel like I'm gonna go with what Iggy says here and say that's racial. As in like, for example, the standard can be the best well-being, but like that's pretty vague, but nobody calls it out for being a vague weighing mechanism. Like roll the ballot arguments are just like framing arguments. If you say the best liberation strategy, that means you should like articulate your arguments in the context of that framework. Just like if anyone was like, adhere to the best well-being, help societal well-being, help maximize lives, like those are still metrics that can be vague. You just have to apply your arguments under them.
Seems like that's a trap question, because either the standard is vague and it allows you to link arguments into it without having to create a super specific unique advocacy, or I have to spec what my unique position is in the framing debate, which excludes you from discussion and makes me open to theory. I would just make it, if somebody asked me that, I'd be like, no, I'm not falling for your trap card.
I also think that question is like probably just not true in terms of like whether or not we can weigh under broad rules about arguments, right? So we make sequencing arguments, we make like root cause arguments, or we just say like which is more effective. So we make like methodology debates in terms of which is more effective in liberating people. So I think that just like the idea that even though the text of it might sound broad, since we already know the way that we weigh
off, or
Yeah.
we're on the impact debate. I don't know. Usually,
Impact terms.
oh yeah, I don't know.
I
Whatever.
can do this, but it's gonna be like a 2-second conversation.
Yeah.
I think that like most of the time, impact terms are not a good idea, especially if they're like identity politics, right? Someone was like ableism, and you're like, ableism is actually really awesome, and that's probably not a good idea. And also probably limits the other types of arguments that you can make. So if you make impact terms, then that means that you probably cannot make permutations or definitely can't make no link arguments. So that means that you're giving yourself pretty much one way out, which is not very strategic. The only other time, I think the only instance in which people think it's like acceptable, I guess, to write impact terms is maybe with captures. That's like the most common time. But like most of the time, I would say impact terms. But even running impact terms with captures still pigeonholes you and having pretty much only one strategy. So still probably not the best idea.
Yeah.
Let's say the NC strategy is one off in case. You like link and impact level, maybe link turns and impact defense. Because they have no offense on case. Just to, that way you can give yourself more options.
What's the negative? Well, you say
Yeah,
they
what's
don't
the-
have any offense on the
Yeah,
case.
they don't
What's
have
the
any.
case?
It's trying to have, they written like a Nietzsche critique and then drops the entire app. It was like 7.1K. And then if you put like impact defense on the link and impact, or maybe like impact turn with link defense.
I would say it's disadvantageous to put just defense on the link. I would just try to find a way to link turn defense and link turns, and then maybe terminal defense on the impact. I don't even know how to do it. Let's use the impact for Nietzsche. Yeah.
So, I was trying to get Elijah to explain this to me, but I'm still kind of confused. Like, I don't understand how, like, he said that if you could impact turn the K, but you could also permit, and because like, it's like a test of competition, like you wouldn't be double turning yourself.
I mean, that's a thing. I mean, the net can call you out on it.
That's a question. Yeah, I guess it's a question of whether you believe the permutation is just a test of competitiveness, or if it's an attempt to add the alternative to the app.
Yeah, I think that's a debate that would just have to happen.
Yeah.
So, like, if the negative calls you out, like, yo, that's contradictory, you can be like, oh, but it's a test of competition. Like, I
But
don't
you
know.
have to be
It's up
prepared
to
to
you.
justify why.
Yeah.
Yeah, you should probably be prepared for that debate. Like why the perm is just testing the competitiveness. It's not an attempt to tack on to the app efficacy.
But as we always say in our logic, if you're losing the permutation, it's a test of competition. If you're winning, it is not your advocacy. So.
Probably a good rule of thumb.
Yeah.
Yeah, impact turns just are, I don't know. There's just so many better strategies you could go for.
I think go for it. And there's 2 impactors. There's a lot of answers.
Yeah, like I said, it pigeonholes you. It really just limits the strategy, and it just seems like it's such a time suck. I mean, especially since the 1AR is so short, I wouldn't invest. I mean, really, I would tell you.
Also, people are probably like really good at defending the impact of their case, probably more so than defending the specific, because they don't like know what the app is prior to run, most likely. So it's probably easier for you to make like no link arguments because they're probably not specific to your advocacy. Or lots of people's alternatives don't really solve for the impact, especially since people have like really big impacts, but probably narrow solvency in terms of the alt. So just going for impact turns probably also is bad because then you can't make all of those way easier, probably way better arguments.
Any questions? Alright, so if you hit a critique, which you will eventually, someday, what arguments when you're in, alright, so you're going into your 1AR. What are the things you should probably focus on? Yes.
Justifying policy and goal of the ballot, probably. If you're,
Depends on what the app is. Let's just say we don't know what the app is. Just
Oh,
like a general rule of thumb, what should you focus on?
Oh, okay.
Yes.
You link yourself.
Okay, so focus on the link story.
And then also make some offensive link turns. Well, not like offensive, but like, like offense. Not like, yeah.
Make some offensive link
Yeah,
Oh, I got you.
yeah. And then, permutate the alts.
So perm, sure. So focus, like perm y'all, probably important. At least to throw permutations on there. Anything else we should focus on? Yes.
Biggest solvency deficit deal.
Yeah, solvency deficit. Alright, so in general, like order of priority, I would say the first thing you probably should do.
Always doing yourself code there.
Huh?
Always D-Link.
Always do link. Always the link.
Oh, okay. Now I get it.
Link
Okay.
from the Legend of Zelda.
Yeah, but I didn't get the link.
The
Like,
link.
D-Link, link,
Oh. Yeah. Lecture's done for you.
Man,
The Legend of Zelda? Come on. Like,
I know Mario, but like,
Mario, but you don't know. Oh.
I haven't played it.
We might have to have
It's like another lecture.
We're done. It's time to. Alright. As long as my roommate doesn't hear it, he's like a fanatic, or he might actually. I actually don't know. But it'd be bad. It'd be bad. So I think, when approaching the critique in the 1AR, the first thing you should ask yourself is, what is there a framing mechanism that the K uses, right? Like i.e. a roll of the ballot, a standard, something that is generating offense for them, right? Or is a metric to determine offense. Then I would say probably the most important thing is to focus on these two things, obviously, the alternative and the link. I would say just the impact is not as important as addressing the link and or the alternative. What do y'all think? Do y'all think that's a pretty good rule of thumb? Like we said before, like maybe 2 solvency deficits and 2 permutations, a pretty sufficient couple of links, no link arguments, and maybe a link turn or 2. Does that make sense? Does anybody have any questions? Oh yeah, theory.
I
I'm
can do
sorry.
that one.
You do theory.
Okay.
You do you.
There's a lot of ways in which you can engage in this. I'll start from the more bad perspective, and then I'll go into the nicer perspective of shorter.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, so a way in which some individuals use theory against these positions would usually be against things like the roll of the ballot, as in like it's really unfair because it's a big weighing mechanism and like I can't get any type of offense. Another way that they usually go for it is like it's unpredictable or it eliminates clash. This is not the type of theory that you want to go for against K teams because if anything, K teams, like the first front lines that K teams usually make are against theory and figure. So they probably know how to defend their case a lot better against a lot of the theory arguments compared to the person initiating theory. Chances are you'll probably misarticulate what exactly the K is saying, and they will try to clown you for that, and probably use it as an offensive reason to vote for them. So you might want to stay away from theory, especially if it links into ideas of fairness, simply because if they're questioning assumptions, if they're questioning notions of institutions, especially a notion of fairness that tries to say like these institutions are supposed to help everyone, will be a really bad route to go because they're going to simply impact turn your notion of fairness and yeah.
So like I've been hearing like Delgado a couple times, and I know like those kind of arguments like fairness. I realized like maybe I've tried it out. I think it seems to work. Maybe if you do the voters, like what their role as a judge is, and like if they don't have a role as a judge, what their role as a ballot is, maybe could that work?
Yeah, so like oftentimes it would be like the role of the judge and the role of the ballot will be used to like not co-opt the theory shell, but kind of like really make it not legitimate anymore. So for example, if the role of the judge is to be a critical educator, they would say you have to question the norms within debate, especially those that theory tries to attempt to keep in place. And if they are foreclosing your ability to be a critical educator, theory is probably not the place you want to go. But sometimes you can use theory in a way that is more productive and more constructive. So maybe not using things that link back into fairness, but using things that link back into their role of the ballot, right? So they're talking about creating acceptability, they're talking about liberating individuals, they're talking about destroying the patriarchy, things like that. You can use theoretical arguments in a way that links back into these roles of the ballot and shows why under their role of the ballot, they're making it a lot worse because they're not debating in a particular way. It functions the same way as if you indict someone's performance, right? So like a team that knows how to use theory will probably take that route. I'll use like a really good example. So like if I'm having theory debates, I really like theory debates against PBC because usually they don't link it back of debate that we're having. If you're going for theory, that is the better strategy to have, simply because it's a lot more, it's like a lot more engagement heavy, and you might be able to persuade certain judges, especially if the team running the case doesn't know how to like sufficiently defend against them. So like if you only have front lines for fairness, and then all of a sudden they're like, no, I'm talking about accessibility, that's really bad, and you can really get them on that level. Another way you can use theory is, so like if the affirmative, like if someone, yeah, what's that?
Could you like, what's an example of like a standard for that there? Like that.
So like instead of saying the voter is fairness, you would say the voter is
Like critical education.
critical education, the voter is like liberation strategies, the voter is literally their role is ballot. But if you want to say, oh, I know, I'll show you the disclosure theory show I read against the Rod one. So it was like disclosure theory. It's like they didn't disclose. The standards were black solidarity. All the systems. And peekaboo activism. And the reason I went for this is because I felt it was like uniquely harmful. So like the affirmative was an argument talking about like hard bodies, right? And I said the best way in which we can actually talk about strategies to alleviate the harms of hard bodies is if one, I actually know what you're talking about, so that way we can have a substantive debate, right? So I went for disclosure theory, and then the standards were like black solidarity, as in when you decide to hide your positions rather than being upfront with it, it creates a lot of hostility within the community, right? So that's very different from a standard like strap skew or time skew, because it's uniquely talking about the way in which it's relating to what the affirmative is talking about, how they're trying to help these individuals. The other way that I did it was in terms of advocacy skills, and I said the best way in which you can defend and actually create strategies that are supposed to help alleviate problems of the oppressed is if you have to confront like someone taking time to prep out your case. It makes it a lot easier to defend. And then this one was more of a joke, but it was like peekaboo activism, as in like you constantly allow for people to go and hide and pick and choose their battles, when a fight against oppression is a fight that you always have to engage in, constantly have to engage in order to help individuals. So like this is very different from like a stereotypical theory shell, and if you do want to go on the theory route, you have to become more creative with your standards and be a lot more substantive. At that point, the theory debate becomes more like a methodology debate, solely in terms of the performance, and isn't theory in the stereotypical sense of like how individuals run it to exclude argument. Does that make sense? Okay. Anything to add to theory? Alright, and what's the final one? Methodology.
Methodology first.
What's that one say about methodology? That's a lot. And we kind of touched upon it. We can talk about it in
You want to go down and do
Okay, so methodology debates, we touched upon it a bunch of times, but that's usually the A strat that you want to go on when you're going against the K. If you feel like a criticism isn't necessarily inclusive of more certain individuals, or you feel like you have a better criticism, or you feel like your affirmative is more inclusive, that's when you get into a method versus method debate. And oftentimes this includes it includes all the things we talked about, doing no links, or like taking out the alternative. If anything, it probably stems a lot in terms of the alternative, because that's where you gain heavy access to the firm ground, and it's also where you can go over things like net benefits, right? Even though it's usually articulated in terms of plan, counterplan permutations, you can still have that on a methods debate. So for example, if someone's reading race and someone's reading cap, if they don't necessarily want to engage in that root cause debate, they can go for permutation, solve back for like these institutions of racism and these institutions of capitalism, so that the net benefit could be potentially not creating systems methodology debate shows how like you can articulate net benefits under the permutation. Does that make sense? Is that a hand raise or
Yeah.
no? Okay, yeah.
How do you answer no perms in methods debate? 'Cause I think there probably are. But
Oh,
like,
yeah.
How do you articulate
Oh
that?
yeah, that's usually where they stem from. So it really depends. I think it depends one on the type of judges and also how they articulate no perm arguments. I personally believe like you should be allowed to make a permutation so long as the permutation is more of a it can happen in the affirmative world, not necessarily like, oh yeah, you're right, this can happen. So in method debates, I feel like permutations are more legitimate than clash of civilization debates, where they're like state good and then all of a sudden they're like perm, embrace the mindset of the neg and then do the act. That is problematic and probably is a co-option argument, as in you didn't have that mindset in the first place. I'm talking about why that's bad, and then all of a sudden you assume you can take it. If that's the case, I would say, if you're running an app like that, the way you can defend against perm index like that are probably going for, like, the plan is not necessarily a bad idea, so even if the mindset of the affirmative is bad, the plan is still good. But then, once again, you'll get into, like, performative index, so you might want to be careful in how your affirmative is structured, or just keep in mind when you're making your affirmative, if a K team were to make this argument, what can I change so they don't have access to making this, or, like, they don't have access to saying I'm co-opting. I think that's something that would have to go into prep in terms of when you're making your affirmative, especially if they're like policy making affirmatives in the stereotypical sense, and that's the way in which you can do that. If it's a methods debate, the way in which you could respond to perm indict is simply by saying, you can simply say, one, it's not a scaling of the performance because what can happen in the negative world is allowed to happen in the affirmative world, or as we said before, the affirmative is key to the alternative, as in the affirmative creates a better platform for the alternative to actually take place. The third way is like, yeah, those are like easy ways in which you can answer to index to the performance of the permutation. You could also say, it's in, for example, if you have like a third-party judge who isn't identifying with either of those structures, I would say a way in which you can deal with permutation index is that the only way for example, if it's two black debaters and they're debating about different forms of critical race theory, a way in which you can deal with performance index is by saying the white judge has no access to what we're talking about. The best way in which he can resolve this debate is one that includes multiple ways in which black people can liberate themselves rather than picking and choosing which one he favors, because chances are it will be one that's simply going to like perpetuate his validity. So in order to minimize that chance, we should allow for both these methods to exist so that way he wouldn't know. Like being a little creative in your responses in terms of performance. Like the best ways in which you indict those are when you're thinking on your feet and you're thinking critically, right? That's the best way in which you can do it. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question about defending case?
Yeah.
How do you like? I've asked this to Dr. Curry, but I'm still a bit confused. How would you answer like speaking for others?
I think we could deduct argument for the speaking for others argument, depending upon what the argument. I think it depends on what kind of argument is being made. So, like, if it's like speaking from others in the sense that you are speaking from a position of privilege, one of the easiest arguments to get out of that is that people like people that you are speaking for do not have a position or a platform, right? Like you are using the privilege that has been afforded to you by having a platform to speak in speech and debate to allow their voices to speak through you, right? Like you're using your time in order to allow for their voices to be heard, right? Which seems to me to be a better alternative than just shutting down any discourse about the other, because that's what the logical conclusion of a speaking for other argument seems to be, which is that like if speaking for others is true, we can just never talk about people that never have the opportunity to speak for themselves, right? Because it seems like you would always fall to that criticism, right? Since you can never get the individual group members necessarily, like those individual members to go up and speak, right? And then there's some people that just can't speak at all. Like what about people that are disabled and are not able to speak, right? How do we speak for them, or how do they speak for themselves, right? At the very least, it's using and recognizing the privileges afforded to you to use the speech time as a vessel for them, right? It's not speaking for others, it's allowing others to speak through you. I think it's a good argument.
Okay, and
I think that's a good argument.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to that because I don't really
I've never
experience
really
that.
had
So like, yeah.
brothers because I ran like raised kids
recognizes the privilege afforded, which I'm sure is one of the arguments people will make in the student credit critique. And instead of saying that that is like a bad thing, right? Like it recognizes it can be transformed into a good thing.
So like I'm not speaking for others, I'm allowed to just like speak for me.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, because the way that they would do it usually is they would ask me in cross-ex, like, if I would read like a FMK or yeah, they would say like, do you identify as like a woman? And I was like, no.
You should say, your answer shouldn't be no, you should be like, I recognize that patriarchy is a real issue, and I've elected to allow my concerns to be put on the back burner to allow those concerns for women to be in the front. You should never make defensive arguments in cross-exes like this, you should turn it into an offensive argument. So the emphasis is now on them already in the debate to try to explain to the judge why that is a bad thing.
So
See
like
what I'm
I
saying? It is a
recognize
preemptive argument you have made in cross-ex, right?
Mhm.
And if they say like, oh, well, no, you can't do that, it's like, well, the argument is almost, the structure for the argument has been made for you in CX, which is especially good if you're the app debater and you only have a 4-minute 1R. Like, the structure has been laid down for you to just continue that kind of narrative, right?
So you just say like, I recognize patriarchy and I'm using my voice to challenge it.
Yeah. Well, not your voice, right? Like, you're using the speech time to allow their voices to come forth.